We looked in terms of how this introduction works. We've been looking throughout all of these letters about the introductions that Jesus gives and the titles that he gives himself as he's introducing these letters. And Jesus introduces himself every time with a title that kind of refers to how he's going to be interacting with each church. And this letter is no different in that. In this letter, he reminds them, as we see, he is the Son of God. Now, that's not something we go, oh, well, that's unusual. But it actually is unusual, because this is the only time that this title is given to Jesus throughout all of the book of Revelation. In chapter 1, we saw that he was called the Son of Man, which is a title of sacrifice, right? It's a pretty big departure for him to be called the Son of God. And by using that title here, I think what he's doing is that he is reminding the church of Thyatira that he is the name above all names, that he has the authority, he alone has the authority to be the divine judge. So he is the true Son of God, and as we continue in his description of himself, who has eyes like flames of fire. I take that to mean he sees all. He sees the works of the hands, certainly, that's within his purview, but he also knows the motives and thoughts of the heart. He has eyes of fire, and the flames indicate that he's not entirely happy with what he sees in the hearts of this church. But he's also the Son of God whose feet are like burnished bronze. Love that description. Now, most of the commentators agree that this indicates that he's doing some sort of marching in victory against his enemies. You would only bring out the really shiny armor when you were on parade. So this is a fairly fierce depiction of Jesus, I think. And so I don't think that I would want to experience Jesus looking like this. If I were the object of his burning eyes, I don't think I would be in a very comfortable position. Maybe you would, but I don't think I would. And ultimately, I think that should cause us to ask what is going on in Thyatira that he needs to have this kind of description of himself. And it appears, as we read through this letter on the surface, that they have a similar problem to the church of Pergamum. There was an influence going on towards sinful, licentious behaviors in the church. But I think that there's a major distinction between Thyatira and what went on in Pergamum, which we looked at last week. Because what we saw last week, that at least the leadership of Pergamum, the church there, was solidly serving God. In fact, they were willing to be cooked to death inside of a brass bull as martyrs. They were holding fast to the word that they heard, at least in terms of the leadership. There were a lot of influences, and they were tempted to go towards those influences. As human beings, we all are. You know what that's like. But here in Thyatira, there was a faction of leadership that was actually saying one thing, saying that I'm a Christian, saying that I believe in Jesus Christ, saying that you believe that he's the Son of God, being and doing and embracing an entirely different set of ideals altogether. And they were embracing these ideals that are actually counter to who Jesus Christ is, and thereby they were actually losing their witness in the community. We'll see that as we go through this whole letter. So what we see ultimately, though, based on the introduction and the first verse that we encounter after the introduction, is that the heart of the church matters. The heart of the church matters. Jesus starts off saying, I know your works, your love and faith and service and patient endurance, and that your latter works exceed your first. Now, hopefully you're getting used to this idea that Jesus starts out, he uses the sandwich method of his rebukes, right? He says something really, really good, and then he gives them the rebuke, and then he says something really, really bad at the end. This is like a management 101 kind of tactic, right? You know this. And so he's giving them a summary of what he likes about them. And this is what he says. He commends them for their growing maturity. It appears that this is an active church. They had works, they had love, they had faith, they had service, they had endurance. It all sounds really, really good. Jesus says, I know your works. And it isn't like, oh, I know the deeds of your past, but you've forgotten your first love, like what he told to the Ephesians. Their deeds were actually exceeding where they had been when they first started. They aren't shrinking back from service. They aren't doing less now. In fact, they're doing more now than what they did at first. And so it appears in context that they had things going pretty well. In fact, it looks like love is what is driving all of these works of service, and faith is motivating their works of service. It's even the right kind of love. It's agape, selfless love, unconditional love. So there's not a false motive here for in terms of their service, and we can't point to that either, because I think ultimately the best motive there is selfless love. Everything that we do, similarly to what Thyatira does, it should be done out of a heart of love, or it is worthless. In fact, Paul says that in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the love chapter. We hear it all the time in weddings. But he says this, if I have faith that can move mountains, but I do not have love, I'm nothing. If I give all that I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but I do not have love, I gain nothing. So love has to be the foundation for everything that I do. And if I don't have love as a foundation for everything that I do, then I have nothing. And a love that won't act is not a genuine love. We see that from 1 John. John writes, "Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth." So back in verse 19 of our passage, Jesus commends them. I know your works. I know that they are born out of love and faith. So ultimately, what Jesus says about the church in Thyatira in verse 19 should be true of our church as well today. We should be a church that's busy serving and loving and responding to God out of our faith and our love. And the end goal of all of it is to see God glorified in us because we love God. That's why in terms of how we talk about our core values, it's always love God, love people. Those two values come first. Because those are the things that motivate us in terms of the rest of our ministry. We preach the word because it's true, certainly, but more importantly, we preach the word because we want to honor the giver of the word, the Lord our God, whom we supposedly love. And so that's why we preach the word, because we love God and we want his word to be known by everybody. And we love everybody, and that's a proof that we love everybody because we don't shirk away from telling them the truth as our God has given it to us. That proves our love for them. We want them to have the whole truth. And so we want to see it accurately represented to them. And so we love God, we love people, we love them so much that we want to bring them the hope of the gospel. This is why we want to reach the world. That's our fourth value, core value. And nothing could be more loving than to be able to present the gospel and see people come to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ, to know that they have an eternity ahead of them of love, of hope, of joy in heaven. And so we reach out to the world because of our love of God to see him glorified and our love of people. So these are all good things that we're seeing in the church of Thyatira. And the church of Thyatira is doing all of these things. But look out. Because even though things look really good on the outside, things may not be going all that well. Because the sin of the church destroys. So while this church appeared to be everything a church ought to be on the surface, this church had a cancer growing internally. It looked good. Everything appeared to be in the right order, but everything was definitely not all well in this church. The eyes of fire had seen a serious problem. And the problem was not the external persecution. That was not the issue for them. They were not dabbling with compromise. No. I think it's far worse than that. This church had a group within it that was openly perverse, and the church was tolerating it. Verse 20 again, "But I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and is teaching and seducing my servants to practice sexual immorality and eat food sacrificed to idols." So the church in Thyatira was being led away from the Lord by the teachings of this influential woman. We don't know exactly who she was. Jesus calls her Jezebel. He uses the name of perhaps the most infamous female in the Old Testament.